On February 22, 1963, a fire broke out in the basement of the six-story Lincoln Building at the corner of Trumbull and Ann Streets in downtown Hartford, Connecticut. Built in 1897 as the headquarters of the Hartford Life Insurance Company, by 1963, the ornate building's most famous tenant was Frank's Restaurant, which had been located on the first floor for more than a quarter century. The fire quickly spread throughout the building, sending billows of smoke out above the city. For over 24 hours, firefighters poured jets of water into the gutted structure. It was a bitterly cold day, and before long, the building and even nearby cars were coated in ice. The devastated structure was soon condemned and demolished. Today, the building's former location is the southwest corner of the Excel Center. In 1963, Herbert J. Steckel had a recurring historical feature in the Hartford Courant newspaper's Sunday magazine called Tales of Old Hartford. It was a successor to his earlier Hartford Then and Now features, which had run in the paper for many years. The recent Lincoln Building fire inspired him to write a piece published on March 24, 1963, called One Fire Recalls Another. He noted the similarities of the Lincoln Building fire to an earlier fire that had destroyed Hartford's Auditorium Building almost a half-century earlier. Both of them were three-alarm fires that had broken out in the month of February on the same block along the north side of Asylum Street. In fact, they were just doors away from each other, and in both cases the ruined structures had to be razed. Another interesting fact is that the auditorium fire of February 26, 1914, was not even the most destructively expensive fire to take place along the north side of Asylum Street in Hartford in that week. 5 days earlier, on February 21, 1914, fire had ravaged Union Station just a short distance to the west, at the corner of Union Place. Unlike the devastated Lincoln and Auditorium buildings, however, the train station was rebuilt and still stands today. This is History with me, Dan, and in this video, I'm going to talk about those two dramatic fires that happened just days apart in February of 1914. Let's start with Union Station, which opened in 1889. It replaced an earlier Union Station built in the 1850s and shown here in the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford. At that time, the train tracks crossed Asylum Street at street level. For the new Union Station, the tracks were elevated as they remain today, so that they pass above Asylum Street. Although back then the station had 4 tracks and now it only has 1. The elevated plan was worked out by Hartford architect George Keller, although he was not chosen to design the actual station, which was instead a Richardsonian Romanesque-style building erected to plans by Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, the successor architectural firm to H. Richardson. The station had been standing a quarter century when disaster struck. The fire took place on the afternoon of Saturday, February 21st, 1914, as the Hartford Courant newspaper reported the following day, quote, "The fire started in the rooms of the Adams Express Company in the north part of the building and, so far as can be learned, was caused by the explosion of an overturned oil stove. The employees of the Express Company tried to put the blaze out with hand extinguishers, giving the task up when the fire gained on them and sending in an alarm from box number 12. The heavy going of the snowbound streets delayed the fire department in arriving at the fire, so that by the time the first streams of water had been turned on, the fate of the building was practically decided. Though they worked frantically and bravely to save the structure, the inevitable conclusion was soon seen." Unquote. Further, quote, "It took little time for the fire to gain headway, and 20 minutes after it started, the inside of the station resembled an inferno, with its rows of benches blazing fiercely and the iron supports on them twisting and melting with the heat. The flames came pouring up through the ceiling and roof of the building with a crackling sound, licking off pieces of the roof one after the other, and letting them drop with a terrific crash into the fiery furnace below." Unquote. The paper also noted, quote, "With the exception of the walls of red sandstone, the entire building was of southern pine, which had seasoned for years and burned like tinder, with flashes of brilliant flame and heavy, oily clouds of dense black and yellow smoke." Unquote. The fire department experienced an initial delay in getting to the fire due to the snow-clogged streets and the throngs of thousands of onlookers. But eventually, under the direction of Chief John C. Moran, there were multiple streams directed at the building. There were many dramatic and heroic moments during the massive fire. Assistant Ticket Agent W.S. Kelly dashed into the mass of flames that was engulfing the ticket office to save what money he could. He emerged with a small box of silver coins worth about $1,000 just moments before, quote, "the walls fell through with a crash, and the burning embers scattered on the floor and shelves." Unquote. The station's mailroom was right next to the burning express offices, but all of the mail was saved by Captain John Dundon and his assistants, who, quote, "succeeded in bundling up the loose mail on the sorting table and carrying out the mail sacks through dense black choking smoke to safety on the west platform. At the last of the job, the mailroom was in flames, but Captain Dundon stuck to the work until every last sack had come out of the burning building." Unquote. The station's waiting room had been quickly cleared, and, quote, "one of the coolest people in the waiting room was Mrs. A. E. Gaffey, the manager of Gaffey's Express, the office of which is near the doors leading to the tracks. She directed the removal of the suitcases and parcels in her care, while thick clouds of smoke filled the air above and lowered to the floor. Not until the smoke was so dense that she could no longer remain did she leave and call her workers out." Unquote. 12 firemen were injured while battling the blaze. 4 of them were nearly killed in an incident described in detail by the Current. Quote, "Hundreds of people watching the fire from the Union Place side were paralyzed with horror for a few minutes when it seemed as though 2 crews of men would be cremated on the tops of extension ladders, where they were caught in one of those things a fireman most dreads, a backdraft. It seemed for a moment that seemed like hours, that the men would either be burned to death while their comrades were powerless to help them, or else be dashed to death on the ground. The crews consisted of Lieutenant Richard J. Collins of Number 7, Lieutenant Michael J. Cosgrove of Number 8, Hosman Daniel Burke of Number 8, and Fireman James Shannon of Number 2. These men had taken 2.5-inch lines up extension ladders before the flames had appeared over the waiting room. Their ladders were raised just south of the main entrance on Union Place, and they had been at work only a few minutes when an ominous cloud of black smoke rolled down over their heads, shutting them out of the view of the people in the street. As soon as the cloud lifted for a second, Chief Moran foresaw what was going to happen, that there would be a hot air explosion, and he shouted to the men to come down. They started, but the same instant there was a dull explosion that sounded like the muffled report of a gun, and a sheet of flame shot out of the windows, into which the firemen had been pouring the water, directly into the faces of the firemen. For a few seconds the fire rolled down over the men, and they seemed enveloped in fire. The force of the flame made Collins lose his hold on the ladder, and he toppled over. 2 of the other men, although painfully burned, grabbed him and held him against the ladder until he regained his footing, and although dazed, he got down with slight assistance from the others. While this was happening, in order to save Collins from a fatal fall, the men had let go of the line of hose which was under engine pressure, and it began threshing around in mid-air like a huge arm, swaying the ladder in a manner that threatened to make it topple at any second. The top of the ladder caught fire, and the combination of mishap made it appear as though none of the men would reach the ground alive. While all were painfully burned, not one lost his head, and they kept up their fight until they had recaptured the threshing line of hose and shut it off, and they all got to the ground. Lieutenant Collins was the worst burned, and when his feet touched the ground he swayed and would have fallen had not other firemen caught him. He instantly regained himself and ran to the aid of his company, which had taken its stand near the south entrance on the Union Place side. When Dr. Ernest A. Wells reached him, he refused to stop work for medical attention until after other members of his company, who had been cut by the glass sent hurtling through the air by the explosion, had first been attended. Then, swathed in bandage, he again returned to work and remained until he was ordered to St. Francis's Hospital. His condition was reported last night as not serious. The others who were burned pluckily remained at work, although they suffered keenly from the cold air and water, striking the burned parts of their faces." Unquote. Among the other injured firemen, several had very narrow escapes from death, including hosman Edward T. Lyons of Engine Company No. 3, who was carrying a line of hose into a third-story window when his captain heard the whistling shriek of a backdraft. Lyons was pulled to safety from the top of a ladder by his comrades just before a powerful blast of flame shot out of the window. Later, he had a second close call when he and his comrades were battling flames in the waiting room, and they had to run for their lives when the roof collapsed. Lyons was furthest from the doorway and got covered by falling debris, but he was rescued and pulled out half unconscious, but still holding on to the nozzle of the hose line, which was recovered with him. Other firefighters suffered from the smoke and falling glass. One was struck in the chest by an out-of-control hose, and another was gashed by one. Pipeman William Malloy of Squad A fell through an elevator shaft and was pulled to safety with a rope. Returning again to the Hartford Current, quote, "Hundreds of men and women on delayed passenger trains crowded to platforms and windows while the coaches were stopped in tracks 3 and 4 and watched the burning building. The roar of the flames could be heard above the noise of the crowds, and the crackling of the big timbers as the flames ate their way through them sounded like the rapid shooting of a machine gun to those on the platforms. The heat of the fire was terrific, and spectators gasped as the firemen ventured on the roof of the building, where the temperature was almost roasting." Unquote. Also, quote, "From the west side of the station, the fire appeared to be stubborn, but making slow progress. Hundreds thronged the platforms there to watch the struggles of the firemen against the flames. The south end of the station appeared slow to start burning, but a few minutes after 3 o'clock the first flicker of flame came through the slate roof near the peak, and from that moment on the advance of the flames at this end of the building could not be checked." Unquote. Also, quote, "Bit by bit, the roof on the western side of the building fell, generally in sections of about 6 feet each, and always dropping inside the 4 walls of the structure, so that no one was underneath, and, fortunately, no one injured by the falling chunks of slate. Suddenly there was a roar of flames, the sound of heavy timbers crashing to the floor of the waiting room, and the high ceiling had gone, giving vent to the furnace of flames inside. Then came the crash of the falling stone of the stone gables, and a squad of firemen within 10 yards of where the 5 tons of stone fell scrambled away. The remaining unsupported piles of stone were given wide berth, and there was no one near when 2 of them fell. At 10 o'clock last night, another gable crashed down. At 3:15, nothing remained but a small section of the roof near the south end of the station and the side walls. The platforms, however, had not caught fire save in one place, and that was quickly extinguished. Each time a section of roof fell, the flames were suddenly liberated and shot 25 feet into the air. By 3:15, it had become apparent that the best policy for the fire department men on the west side of the building would be to cooperate in the work of preventing other buildings from being endangered, and a squad from Company Number 1 was sent to the remaining small section of roof to chop through and drop it to the inside of the burning structure. The firemen fought against heavy odds in their work with the heavy axes, for the heat was intense on the roof of the station, and they were in constant danger from flames and from the likelihood of the roof crashing through. Spectators were ordered from the middle platform, where several hundred had stood until that time, at 3:25, and thereafter, except for newspaper men and railroad men, admission to this platform was given only those who showed tickets for northbound trains." Unquote. After the fire, the station was left in ruins. The last living thing to be taken out of the building was a kitten, discovered by a fireman who heard a faint meowing in the wreck of the station restaurant. The cat was a pet of the restaurant staff, allowed to eat scraps from the kitchen, but it had not been able to escape when the fire started. For hours, as water from the fire hoses poured in and burning timbers showered down from above, the cat, shielded under a marble counter, had struggled to keep its head above the rising water until it was rescued by the firemen, who took the kitten to a lunchroom across the street, where, quote, "a bowl of hot milk and a warm blanket by the radiator soon had it purring in content." Unquote. At the time, losses from the fire were estimated at $250,000. The station had been gutted, but its Portland brownstone walls were retained, and the structure was rebuilt. A notable difference of the resurrected building compared to the way it had been before the fire was the station's central entrance section, which had earlier had a hip roof with dormer windows. This was now raised to a full 2 stories, giving it a more rectangular appearance that it retains to this day. 5 days later, on February 26th, there was another devastating fire. It broke out in what was called the Auditorium Building, which contained the Happy Hour Theater. The Italianate structure had originally been built in 1860 as Allyn Hall. By 1914, the theater was showing motion pictures, but in years past it had been Hartford's premier theater space, and notable speakers from Charles Dickens and Mark Twain to Frederick Douglass and Henry Ward Beecher had appeared on its stage. The theater was above the ground floor, which contained spaces for shops. The fire started in the rear of the G.W. Fuller Company trunk store. According to the Current, as the city building inspector later learned, quote, "some employees of the G.W. Fuller Company had been melting glue that they were to use in repairing leather with a gasoline torch, and that the fire had apparently started from an explosion of the torch. The work was being done in a back room of the store directly under the theater flies, and the fire which started spread quickly and mounted through the flies into the blind attic at the top of the building." Unquote. Many of the same scenes from the earlier Union Station fire were repeated for the Auditorium Building fire. Quote, "the 3 alarms of the fire, as well as the wall of smoke and flame which was visible from every part of the city, brought out an immense crowd of spectators, some of whom were in the way of the firemen when they had started their work, and a few of whom were in danger of collapsing walls at various times during the progress of the fire. Asylum, Trumbull, Ann, and Allen streets were jammed with people who watched the fire and the work of the firemen. A squad of police under the direction of Chief Garrett J. Farrell and Captain John F. Butler roped off the street and kept the crowds at a respectful distance. The smoke from the engines that were pumping water for the fire rolled out in heavy black clouds, which reached as far east as City Hall and gave the appearance from some quarters of a general conflagration involving the whole business section of the city." Unquote. Also, quote, as was the case at the station fire, the streets soon were filled with excited people watching the firemen work and swapping conjectures as to what would be the outcome of the fire, especially if it got beyond the control of the firemen and reached the surrounding buildings. Asylum Street was clogged with spectators as far up as Main Street and to the west of the burning building, and children watchers stood, unmindful of the water that flowed down the street as far down as the Hotel Bond, unquote. It was still wintertime, and, quote, all the apparatus had trouble in getting to the auditorium on account of the condition of the snow-covered streets, and some of the engines, trucks, and horse wagons were very seriously delayed, the horses being unable to make the long trips required of them with any degree of speed. For nearly half an hour after the start of the fire, apparatus was seen making slow progress to Asylum Street from every section of the city, and the horses attached to the vehicles had to be urged to their utmost to be induced to travel at any pace faster than a walk. The delay caused by the condition of the streets was an important cause contributing to the seriousness of the fire, as was the case last Saturday when Union Station was gutted. Within a few minutes from the time the second and third alarms had been sounded, the fire had burned a huge hole through the center of the roof, and a column of heavy black smoke, mingled with streaks of orange-colored flame, was shooting up into the air, hanging over the building in the form of a pillar of smoke that was visible for miles around. Streams poured into the building from nearby roofs, and a heavy stream shot up from Asylum Street, with the united force of 3 lines of hose behind it, had little effect on the hot fire raging beneath the pillar of smoke. Meanwhile, Chief Moran had sent a hurry call for the water tower. The crowd that had gathered on Asylum Street set up a cheer when they saw the tower coming down Asylum Street, and everyone waited anxiously as the heavy pipe was raised to a perpendicular and the hose lines were coupled to it. The tower's trip to the fire took up about 15 minutes, and it was fully 7 or 8 minutes before an effective stream was running from the pipe. While the firemen were struggling to get the water tower into play, men in and near the building set up a shout that the walls were about to fall, and the men on the ground looked up and saw that the center of the front wall was buckling near the top. A huge crack had formed in an arc, and the wall seemed to wave as if it was being pushed out by the force of the flames within. Immediately, a succession of inarticulate cries from firemen within the building echoed from every direction, as the firemen shouted to each other that the building was no longer safe and that everyone would have to run for his life. The cries mingled with the shouts of hundreds of excited persons in the streets and on neighboring roofs, as they saw the heads of the firemen appearing at the windows in response to the cries, and as the firemen on the ground coolly continued their work of coupling up the lines which were to connect the tower with the engines. While the men within the building sought exits, the ones on Asylum Street kept at their work without even looking up, waiting for the actual crash of the fall before fleeing. The crash came sooner than they had expected, and bystanders who looked on heard a single sharp crack, which was immediately followed by a sight that caused more thrills in the space of the minute than Hartford's citizens have felt in many years. The wall crumpled near the top and started to fall out into the street in a long heavy sheet that would have reached to the opposite sidewalk when it gave away at a second point lower down and slid to the sidewalk and gutter. The firemen were able to get away in safety. At the time the wall fell, Asylum Street, opposite the auditorium, was jammed with persons who were watching the fire, as well as with firemen, and few of them realized the meaning of the shouts that they heard in time to get out of the way. If the wall had continued as it started, falling in a sheet across the street, these spectators would certainly have been caught under the shower of masonry, as very few of them were able to get out of the way when the wall fell. It was then seen that the falling of the wall had been an aid to the firemen, as the standpipe stream and the tower stream were directed into the center of the fire, which was exposed at a point directly in front of the tower. The 2 streams were then concentrated on the blaze within the building. The falling wall had left two sections of the front wall standing, which were supported only at the corners where they were joined onto the east and west walls, and after these walls had been weakened by the fire, it was seen that the two sections of the front wall were in a weak condition. The firemen tried for several minutes to batter down the sections by turning the concentrated stream of the water tower on them, aiming to throw the sections toward the inside of the building. But excepting for some chunks broken away, the walls stood in spite of the pressure. The crowd then had an opportunity to see what sort of work could be done by the water tower as the stream was playing into every part of the building, shifting from one point to another in quick response to the light touches of the controlling wheel at the base of the pipe. From the arrival of the tower, when it was placed in position and the slender steel pipe was slowly pushed up in its skyward trip, till the water was turned off and the tower hauled back to its station, the crowd took its eyes off the tower only when the wall fell and threatened the lives of the struggling firemen. Unquote. As mentioned earlier, quote, after the central section of the building had collapsed, great chunks of the wall remained in a dangerous position at the top of the remaining sections, extending over the vacant space and apparently liable to fall at any moment. The water tower stream was directed against these chunks and tore the bricks away, breaking them off and reducing the danger from them. It also tore the heavy girders that supported the north end of the roof from their place and sent them crashing down inside the sidewalls soon after it was put into operation. The tower was damaged but only slightly when one side of it was scratched by falling bricks when the front wall collapsed. It was feared just before the wall toppled that the tower might be buried under the falling bricks and mortar. Unquote. As with the Union Station fire, there were heroic actions on the part of firefighters. Ladderman James R. Rafferty of Truck Company No. 3 attracted particular notice with his dramatic climb by ladder up the side of the collapsing building to reach the third floor, where firemen were believed to be trapped inside. As the Current described it, quote, it was the most dramatic moment of the fire, and there were thrills aplenty from start to finish. It seemed to the hundreds who watched him that he would slip from the scaling ladder, which was leaning at a dangerous angle, or that, worse yet, the tottering wall would crumble and bury him under tons of brick and mortar. Unquote. Rafferty's climb came after the big section of wall fell into the street. As I mentioned, it was feared that a number of firemen had been trapped inside on the building's third floor. The men outside rushed around trying to figure out a way to rescue them. Quote, a ladder, far too short to reach the window of the room, was placed against the side of the building, and Fireman Rafferty ascended it, carrying with him one of the light scaling ladders. Reaching the top, he hooked the ladder over the ledge of the window on the third floor and began the most perilous part of the climb. The wall of the building looked as though it might fall at any moment. The entire center section had dropped away, and great cracks were evident in the bricks of the remaining southwest corner. While the plucky fireman was scaling the wall, not more than 25 feet from the top, the upper part of the wall was swaying and seemed ready to topple on him. In a couple of minutes, it seemed longer to the hundreds looking on, Rafferty had reached the window and was inside the room. A group of firemen at one of the hose nozzles began playing water on the wall above him, and dozens shouted in horror, believing that the force of the stream might hasten the fall of the wall. The stream was directed elsewhere. A few moments elapsed, then Rafferty reappeared at the window, signaled that there was nobody in the room, and started his trip to the ground, reaching there in a minute or two, bringing the light scaling ladder with him. Afterwards, it was learned that the firemen who had been in the room had made their way to a rear stairway, reaching the ground in safety. Unquote. People in the crowd frequently spoke to each other in admiration at the courage of the firemen. Unlike Union Station, which was rebuilt, the ruins of the Auditorium Building were demolished and replaced with a new theater, the Majestic, which later became E.M. Lowe's, and stood until the late 1960s when it was demolished to make way for the Hartford Civic Center, now called the XL Center. If you want to learn more about the other buildings that used to stand on this block of Asylum Street, check out my video about it. Also, let me know in the comments if you want me to do more videos about historic Hartford fires. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.